You know, there is something interesting about a game like Honkai Star Rail. On one hand, the game genuinely feels like a massive polished JRPG. The soundtrack is excellent, the visual direction is incredible, the combat system, while simple at first, is surprisingly strategic. And unlike many mobile games, it actually feels like a fully realized RPG experience. Yet, on the other hand, the longer you play it, the stranger the game starts to feel. Because eventually, you begin to notice that almost every system in the game is built around one main central objective, and that is player retention. And once you catch that, you start noticing it everywhere in the game, from story content to endgame content as well. This video is not about whether gacha games are evil or predatory. In my opinion, what is far more interesting to talk about is how monetization begins reshaping the game's design itself, slowly transforming Honkai Star Rail from what could have been one of the strongest modern JRPGs on the market into something caught between two identities, part traditional console RPG and part mobile live service game. Let me start by saying that I do not think the writing in HSR is terrible by any means. In fact, some moments are excellent. Penacony especially showed that writers are capable of creating strong atmosphere, memorable visual storytelling, emotional intrigue, and compelling themes. My problem is not that the game lacks quality. The problem is that the story exists inside a live service monetization structure, and eventually, that structure starts affecting the storytelling itself. Traditional RPGs usually focus on a relatively small cast. You spend dozens of hours slowly building relationships with the same characters. But gacha games structurally cannot do that for long simply because they constantly need new characters to market. Penacony Arc is probably a clear example of this. During that storyline, the game tried to fit in Sunday, Robin, Misha, Gallagher, Aventurine, Dr. Ratio, Black Swan, Sparkle, Acheron, Firefly, Jade, and of course the Astral Express. As a result, the main quest starts feeling stretched far beyond its natural pacing. Not necessarily because the story lacks ideas, but because too many characters are fighting for screen time simultaneously. And besides that, the story constantly shifts focus because the banner cycle demands continuous character promotion. Take Dan Hang in Bibeter Lune for instance. His transformation received enormous narrative emphasis with dramatic reveals and emotional flashback. And coincidentally, this happened right before his banner release. This shows that the narrative is not simply telling a story, it is also preparing a sales cycle which may make the emotion moments fake. And nowhere is this more obvious than Firefly, a masterclass when it comes to emotional attachment as monetization. The Penacony storyline invests an enormous amount of effort into building an emotional attachment to Firefly. She is framed as vulnerable, lonely, and burdened by a terminal chronic illness. To top it all off, Honkai Star Rail carefully planned deeply intimate moments between her and the Trailblazer. The community's reaction was entirely predictable. Fan art exploded, analytical discussion videos flooded YouTube, and players became emotionally obsessed. When her banner finally dropped, the payoff for Hoyoverse was massive, generating astronomical revenue. Now, I'm not calling the players who fell for this as stupid. After all, I'm sitting here as a proud E2S1 Firefly owner myself. What I'm trying to say here is that gacha games have become terrifyingly expert at using emotional storytelling for financial gain. When you really think about it, the psychological precision behind it is brilliant, but incredibly scary at the same time. Another major issue is pacing. Because gacha games are live service titles, their narratives are inherently fragmented across several months. And once again, the Penacony arc is a good example here. The setup was incredibly strong, packed with constant suspense and mystery. However, players had to consume the story in an isolated patch cycles, with each cliffhanger stretched out over more than a month. No matter how compelling a story is, stretching content this thin rarely works well in the gaming industry and can destroy narrative momentum. And narrative momentum is further dragged down by long, static dialogue sequences. In Amphorius, some patch stories stretched close to 10 hours, yet huge portions of that runtime were spent in rigid, unchanging scenes. Characters often just stand in a room talking for extended periods while the player passively clicks through endless exposition. It can become incredibly exhausting for the player. Penacony also revealed another major issue. The game increasingly struggles to commit to permanent consequences. Repeated fake deaths and reversals slowly weaken dramatic tensions because players eventually learn that major characters were rarely in genuine danger. And once players stop believing consequences are real, emotional investment becomes much harder to sustain. This is one of the dangers of live service storytelling. Killing major characters becomes risky because those characters are also monetized products. And finally, there is another strange problem that traditional RPGs usually don't have. Gacha systems often spoil their own narratives. I remember my friend who recently joined the game and decided to use my Firefly for farming. And by doing so, he accidentally discovered one of Penacony's biggest twists before naturally reaching it in the story. And this happens constantly throughout the game. Promotional banners reveal future forms. For instance, Silverwolf 999 being on the banner tells players that she will eventually undergo some kind of major transformation and remain important later in the narrative. Because the story is not allowed to unfold naturally, it becomes harder to treat the game like a traditional RPG. Ironically, and looking back now, I started playing the game in 2.2, just before Firefly was released. Back then, I could binge entire arcs continuously without waiting months between updates. The game felt amazing not because older arcs were better, but I think because once I caught up, the live service structure itself slowly weakened my emotional investment to the point where I'm not finding the story enjoyable anymore. In the endgame, this is where the monetization structure becomes impossible to ignore. In a traditional game, endgame design is built around player mastery. In a live service gacha like Honkai Star Rail, it is built around engagement longevity, and that requires a constant cycle of new products. To be fair, Star Rail avoids catastrophic sudden power creep. Some older units can still technically clear content, but because developers cannot realistically nerf a paid character after a release, balance becomes a one-directional street. The game can only ever move upward, higher damage ceilings, stronger relics, and more powerful supports. This one-directional balance is done in different ways. We can first notice this by the release of new characters that completely overshadows older ones, to the point that if you have both characters, you would always choose to pick the newer unit instead in almost 99% of the scenarios. Look at how Sparkle optimized the exact turn manipulation strength that made Bronya exceptional, or how Fei Xiao overshadowed Dr. Ratio's role in a follow-up team. This is a major issue in my opinion, because it makes older character that you spent your pools on almost completely irrelevant. Another way that this one-directional balance is affecting the game is by breaking the rules of the game. The core gameplay system we started with slowly loses relevance. Early Honkai Star Rail emphasized weakness breaking as a fundamental mechanic where you carefully match elements and manage breakbars. But over time, the game stopped evolving horizontally and began escalating by simply bypassing its own rules. Silverwolf arrived to partially bypass elemental restriction with her weakness implant mechanic. Acheron followed, allowing her ultimate to ignore the weakness system entirely. And finally, Firefly pushed break mechanics so aggressively that original elemental limitations became irrelevant. When combat design shifts from tactical planning to simply rewriting the rulebook with newer units, balancing starts feeling less like careful design and more like perpetual inflation. This brings us to the ultimate limitation of live service balancing. The game is forced to fix structural problems by piling even more systems on top of old ones. To its credit, Hoyoverse tries to inject health back into the ecosystem. They introduce mechanics like Nova Flare buffs to keep older units afloat, or release new supports that suddenly revive dead archetypes. But look closely at that cycle, particularly with break teams. For a long time, break teams dominated the meta, but as the game shifted into the 3.x versions, developers artificially lowered their effectiveness by introducing enemies with massive bloated toughness bars that took forever to break. Suddenly, the archetype's flow was exposed, doing zero damage until a break finally happens. But Hoyoverse already had the solution waiting on a banner. They introduced Dahlia, a character whose entire kit allows your team to deal super break damage before the enemy's bar is actually broken. When you look at it through that lens, the balancing process inherently becomes a loop. The game creates a frustrating design problem and then sells you the exact premium unit designed to bypass that limitation. This is where Hoyoverse traps you using something called the sunk cost fallacy. Think about it, you've already spent years building a specific team. Now the game forces you into a corner. Either you spend your hard-earned pools on a brand new support character just to fix that team and make it usable again, or you skip the banner and watch your favorite character become less powerful or even irrelevant. At that point, you aren't pulling a new character because you want to. You're just doing it just to protect the time and money you already threw into the game. This selling the solution to a problem is also incredibly obvious when you look at how characters are designed at baseline. Increasingly, new units are released feeling slightly incomplete, requiring you to pull their signature Lycon or Eidolons, or even both, just to make their kits function smoothly. A perfect example is Yun Li. Because her entire playstyle revolves around counterattacks, she benefits immensely from her signature Lightcom. It features a built-in taunt mechanic that drastically increases her chance of being hit, and the more Yulni gets hit, the more she deals damage. The final nail in the coffin is the brutal, RNG-heavy relic system. Every gacha player knows this exact heartbreak. You spend weeks farming, and you finally get the right relic piece from the right set with the perfect main stat and both crit stats as substats. It looks flawless, but then you upgrade it, and every single roll rolls directly into flat defense. The relic system is buried under so many layers of RNG that finding a perfect piece feels statistically impossible. But this frustration isn't a design oversight, it's the ultimate retention tool. By locking character power behind layers of random chance, the game creates an endless loop of infinite progress, allowing Hoyoverse to keep players logging in every single day without needing to constantly build new, handcrafted content. Finally, because stellar jades, which are the premium currency needed to pull new characters, are strictly limited, players face constant pressure to log in and grind through generic, low effort events just to hoard them. Let's be honest, the vast majority of the community only participates in these side activities for the sole sake of getting the jades. By scattering tiny amounts of currency across every single corner of the game, from map exploration to tedious limited time events, however, subtly forces you to engage with content you might otherwise completely ignore. Over time, this design successfully manipulates you into building a rigid daily habit. You log in, clear your dailies, and complete mini games that have absolutely zero relation to the high quality RPG experience we all actually signed up for. To conclude, I don't think Honkai Star Rail is a bad game. In fact, I think that's exactly what makes it so fascinating, because underneath all of the aggressive monetization systems, there is clearly an immense amount of real talent here. Excellent music, strong art direction, memorable characters, and engaging combat, and some legitimately powerful story moments. But because this game exists inside a live service gacha structure, it can never fully prioritize artistic closure. The story cannot truly conclude, the progression cannot truly end, the grind cannot disappear. Because if the player ever feels complete, the retention loop stops working. And that's that for today's video. If you enjoyed what you saw today, feel free to hit the like button, and if not, hit the dislike. Also, consider subscribing to the channel if you enjoy game design content. With that said, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.